The young officer thought he was just dressing down an old janitor for being in a restricted area. He was wrong. What that janitor did next would not only end the officer's career but would unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of command. It was a truth universally acknowledged on Fort Stryker that if a job was dirty, thankless, and beneath the dignity of a modern tech-focused soldier, it belonged to Henry Johnson. He was a fixture, a ghost in a yellow jumpsuit who materialized with a bucket and mop whenever a spill occurred and faded back into the institutional beige of the hallways when it was gone. He was old, somewhere north of 60, with a stoop in his shoulders and a network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. To the young pilots and mechanics of the 1st Attack Reconnaissance Battalion, he was just Henry, part of the scenery. They would stride past him in the cavernous Hangar 3, their flight suits crisp and their talk full of acronyms and bravado, never once making eye contact. They'd leave greasy rags on the floor and empty energy drink cans on the workbenches, confident the mess would simply vanish by morning. Henry never complained. He just cleaned, his movements slow but deliberate, methodical. His favorite place was near Apache 714, the pride of the fleet. He spent more time on that one helicopter than any other. While the maintenance crews ran their digital diagnostics and swapped out modular components, Henry would be there with a soft cloth and a bottle of polish, working on the canopy until it was a flawless black mirror, or he'd be on his hands and knees, meticulously picking up stray bits of safety wire and dropped screws from the concrete floor around its landing gear. A young specialist no older than 20 watched him one afternoon. Henry was focused on the Apache's M230 chain gun, the 30mm cannon nestled in its chin turret. He wasn't just wiping it down. He had a set of specialized, non-regulation brushes and picks, and he was cleaning the feed mechanism with a watchmaker's precision. "Hey, Pops," the specialist called out, a smirk on his face. "You don't have to do all that. We run a full systems check on that thing twice a day." Henry didn't look up. "Dirt's a patient enemy, son," he rasped, his voice dry as dust. "It finds a way in." The specialist just chuckled and walked away, shaking his head. He didn't see the way Henry's fingers traced the seams of the cannon's housing, a touch that was less like cleaning and more like a reunion with an old friend. This quiet, invisible man knew more about this weapon than anyone on the base, but no one had ever thought to ask. Because Henry knew the smallest grain of sand in the wrong place at the wrong time could turn a $1-million weapon into a useless lump of metal. Chief Warrant Officer 5, Marcus Thorne, didn't walk. He glided. As a master aviator with over 7,000 flight hours, he moved through the world with the calm, predatory grace of a man who had spent a lifetime at the apex of his profession. He was on Fort Stryker for a pre-deployment evaluation, and he missed nothing. His eyes, accustomed to scanning miles of hostile terrain from a vibrating cockpit, saw things other people didn't. As he strode through Hangar 3, his gaze swept over the rows of Apaches, the bustling crews, the organized chaos of a modern Army airbase. And then he saw the janitor. At first it was nothing, just an old man cleaning the chin turret of an AH-64. But then Thorne's practiced eyes narrowed. It was the way the man was holding his tools, the specific methodical sequence of his actions as he worked on the 30mm cannon's feed chute. It wasn't just cleaning, it was a diagnostic field strip, a long obsolete technique taught to only one type of soldier, in one specific place, for one very dark purpose. It was a ritual, a signature. Thorne stopped dead. The air seemed to crystallize around him. The hustle and bustle of the hangar faded into a dull roar. His mind, a finely tuned machine for threat assessment, was screaming. He watched as the old man finished his work and then, with the knuckle of his thumb, tapped a precise 3-beat rhythm on the side of the gun's housing. Tap. The blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face. It wasn't possible. It was a ghost story, a myth whispered by old-timers over warm beer, a signal that hadn't been seen or used in 30 years. It was a sign that meant one of the most dangerous men of the Cold War was standing 30 feet away from him, dressed in a janitor's jumpsuit. The chief warrant officer felt a cold dread mixed with a terrifying sense of awe because he knew that old man wasn't just a veteran. Thorne approached slowly, his boots making no sound on the oil-stained concrete. He kept his distance, his posture carefully non-threatening. The old man, Henry, was now wiping down the helicopter's targeting sensor, his back to the chief. Thorne cleared his throat. It was the driest sound he'd ever made. "They say the Sand Devils threw one hell of a party after Operation Sundown," Thorne said, his voice low, testing the waters. Henry paused his work. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders seemed to gain a fraction of an inch in width. His voice, when it came, was like gravel being poured over dry leaves. "Never made it to the party. We were busy cleaning up the mess." The confirmation hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It was a password and a key, unlocking a door to a past Thorne had only ever read about in classified after-action reports. Every legend, every nightmare he'd ever heard about the men who went where no one else would, was suddenly standing right in front of him. He felt an instinctual urge to snap to attention, to salute, but he fought it down. Henry finally turned. His eyes, which had seemed tired and vacant before, were now sharp, clear, and appraising. They held an authority that Thorne, a man who advised generals, had not encountered in decades. The old janitor looked him up and down, a silent assessment that stripped Thorne of his rank and prestige, leaving only the soldier. "You're a long way from home, Chief," Henry said. "It wasn't a question, just an inspection," Thorne replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Good," Henry said, turning back to his work. "Inspect somewhere else." It was a dismissal, a quiet, undeniable command from a man in a janitor's uniform to a chief warrant officer 5. And Thorne, to his own astonishment, found himself obeying. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, turned on his heel, and walked away without another word. The power dynamic in Hangar 3 had just been fundamentally broken. The janitor kept polishing the glass, but now the whole world knew he was watching. The chief warrant officer moved like a man who'd just seen a ghost. He found the hangar operations sergeant major, a burly, no-nonsense man named Griggs, in his glass-walled office overlooking the hangar floor. Thorne didn't knock. He just entered and closed the door behind him. "Griggs," Thorne said, his voice tight. "Who is the janitor?" "The one working on 714. Sergeant Major Griggs leaned back in his chair, annoyed by the intrusion. "Name's Henry Johnson. Some old-timer from the VA work program." "Why?" Thorne leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Get Base Commander Thorne on the phone. Right now." "The Colonel?" Griggs balked. "For a janitor?" "Chief, with all due respect, the Colonel is busy preparing for the SecDef visit." "This is more important than the Secretary of Defense," Thorne hissed, his eyes burning with intensity. Tell him we have a watchman on the premises. Use that word. He'll understand." Griggs, seeing the utter seriousness in the master aviator's face, swallowed his objections and picked up the phone. The word watchman hung in the air like a live grenade. Down on the hangar floor, the ripple effect was beginning. A few of the senior NCOs who had seen the exchange between Thorne and the janitor were now watching Henry with a new, confused respect. They started muttering to each other, pointing subtly. Why would the legendary CW5 Thorne speak to a janitor and then walk away like he'd been slapped? The whispers spread like a contagion. Junior enlisted soldiers, catching the change in atmosphere, started staring too. The casual indifference they usually showed Henry was curdling into a mixture of fear and profound curiosity. Work slowed. Conversations dropped off whenever Henry shuffled past with his cart. The entire social fabric of the hangar was reweaving itself around him in real time, and through it all Henry just kept working. He finished with the Apache and started sweeping the floor, his movements as slow and deliberate as ever, seemingly oblivious to the storm of speculation that now had him at its center. He was a stone dropped into a pond, and the ripples were about to become a tidal wave. Colonel James Thorne was a man who believed in org charts and chains of command. He was ambitious, sharp, and had an ego polished to a fine sheen by a fast-track career. When he stormed into the hangar, trailed by the pale-faced Sergeant Major Griggs and the grim-looking CW5, he was radiating pure annoyance. "All right, Chief, you pulled me out of a SecDef briefing for this," the colonel snapped, his eyes locking on Henry, who was now quietly wiping down a workbench. "This had better be good. Who is this guy?" "CW5. Thorne stood ramrod straight. "Sir, with respect, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't who he is, it's what he is." The colonel scoffed. "Don't play games with me, Marcus." "No game, sir," the chief replied, his voice deadly serious. "I saw him servicing the 30 mil on Apache 714. He was performing a Nomad protocol field check." He finished with a 3-tap confirmation signal. "Sir, that protocol and that signal belong to only one unit." The colonel's expression faltered for a second. "Nomad? That's a bogeyman story, Chief. A myth." "It was no myth, sir," the CW5 pressed. Task Force Nomad was real. A ghost unit under JSOC, active from the late 70s to the early 90s. Their specialty was deep battlefield recovery and asset denial. When a friendly aircraft went down 100 miles behind enemy lines, they didn't send a rescue party. They sent a 2-man Nomad team. Their job was to get to the wreckage, repair it under fire using whatever they could find, and then fly or drive it out of the hot zone. They were masters of enemy hardware because they trained on it constantly. They were mechanics, pilots, and assassins all rolled into one. They were called watchmen because they watched the flock from the shadows. That man, sir, the CW5 said, pointing a trembling finger at Henry, is a watchman. Colonel Thorne stared, the implications washing over him. Ghosts didn't wear janitor uniforms. Legends didn't sweep floors, but something in the chief's absolute certainty made a cold knot of doubt form in his stomach. The colonel marched across the hangar floor, his polished boots echoing in the sudden silence. The entire hangar staff, from the lowest private to the senior NCOs, had stopped work. They could feel the charge in the air, the sense that a line was about to be crossed. Colonel Thorne came to a stop directly in front of the old man, his shadow falling over the workbench Henry was cleaning. "All right, fun's over," the colonel said, his voice loud and condescending. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing with my chief warrant officer, but it ends now. You will tell me who you are. That's an order." Henry Johnson slowly, deliberately placed his cleaning rag on the workbench. He straightened up. It was a subtle movement, but the stoop in his shoulders vanished. The years seemed to melt away, replaced by a spine of forged steel. He met the colonel's gaze, and for the first time his eyes were not empty or tired. They were like chipped flint, ancient and hard. Just then, the colonel's aide, a young captain, sprinted across the hangar, clutching a tablet, his face sheet white with panic. Sir, you need to see this. It just came down from the Pentagon Records Division, Level 7 clearance." Colonel Thorne snatched the tablet, his annoyance flashing. He looked down at the screen. He read. The color drained from his face. His arrogance, his confidence, his entire worldview crumbled in the space of 5 seconds. He looked from the tablet back to the old man, his mouth slightly agape. The name on the screen was Henry Johnson, but the file attached to it was something else entirely. The colonel's voice, when he finally spoke, was a choked whisper that carried across the silent hangar. "Master Sergeant Henry Johnson, call sign Nomad 1. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with disbelief as he recited the commendations from memory. Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with Valor, 5 Purple Hearts. He looked up, his face a mask of profound shock and shame. In front of the entire battalion, Colonel James Thorne's back went rigid. His hand snapped to his brow in the sharpest, most respectful salute of his life. "Sir," he breathed, the word filled with a reverence no one had ever heard from him before. "My deepest apologies." The janitor, the ghost, was now the highest authority in the room, and he hadn't said a single word. Henry returned the colonel's salute with a crispness that defied his age. It was a gesture of pure, disciplined muscle memory. He held it for a beat, his eyes locked on the colonel's before dropping his hand. The entire hangar seemed to exhale at once. He didn't acknowledge the colonel's question. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the gleaming black helicopter he had been tending to all day. "That bird, Colonel," Henry said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. "Apache 714. I was hired for this contract 6 months ago specifically to get close to it. Its digital flight log has been altered. Edits were made last night at 0200, deleting the last 30 hours of maintenance records and inserting a ghost diagnostic loop." He walked towards the Apache, running a hand along its fuselage. "More importantly," he continued, stopping beneath the cockpit, "its targeting and fire control software has been compromised. There's a ghost subroutine, dormant, waiting. It activates on a single, specific audio command." He finally turned back to face the stunned command group. "I'm not here because of some old war story, Colonel. I'm here because of what this helicopter is about to do." The past had just become terrifyingly present. Colonel Thorne struggled to process the information. His mind, trained for conventional threats, couldn't grasp the sheer audacity of it. "What are you talking about, Sergeant?" "That Apache is our lead demonstration aircraft. It's scheduled to perform a flight demonstration for the Secretary of Defense and his entire staff tomorrow morning." Henry nodded grimly, his expression unreadable. "I know. That's the entire point of the exercise." He let the silence hang for a moment, letting the full weight of the implications settle on them. "The trigger isn't a button," Henry explained, his voice dropping lower. "It's a phrase buried in the Secretary's planned public address. The moment he says the words "securing our future," it will be broadcast over the open net. Apache 714, which will be hovering in a simulated attack posture 1,000 yards away, will interpret that phrase as a fire command. It will automatically acquire the largest heat signature in its target box, the viewing stand, and unleash its entire rocket and cannon payload." He paused. "The kill switch is buried in layers of encrypted code. Code my unit designed 30 years ago to be unbreakable. I'm the only person left alive who knows how to write the counter command and disarm it." He looked around the hangar, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the mechanics and crew chiefs. "And the saboteur who put it there," he said, his voice turning to ice, "is one of you." As the last word left Henry's lips, the world exploded. A series of shaped charges placed with military precision along the hangar's main I-beams detonated in a deafening roar of fire and shrapnel. The ground shuddered. The massive multi-ton hangar doors at both ends of the building slammed shut with the force of a battering ram, plunging the vast space into the eerie blood-red glow of the emergency lighting. The lockdown was absolute. A voice, digitally distorted and chillingly calm, crackled over the hangar's internal address system. "The watchman is compromised. Sanitize the asset. All assets." The trap wasn't just set, it was sprung. The time for talking was over, and the time for dying had just begun. Chaos erupted. Young soldiers trained for the open battlefield scrambled for cover behind tool chests and equipment stands, their faces masks of confusion and fear. Colonel Thorne, reacting on instinct, bellowed for a tactical response team into his radio, but the only reply was the harsh crackle of static. All communications to the outside world were cut. In the center of the swirling panic stood Henry Johnson, a rock in a maelstrom. The red emergency lights cast his weathered face in sharp relief, and he was perfectly terrifyingly calm. He looked less like a janitor and more like a predator in his natural habitat. He turned to the ashen-faced CW-5. "Chief, get the colonel and his aide to the ordnance locker in the west corner. It's reinforced. Keep their heads down." He then locked eyes with Sergeant Major Griggs. "Sergeant Major, I need a hardline terminal, now." With a fluid motion that seemed impossible for a man his age, Henry unzipped his yellow jumpsuit. Beneath it, he wasn't wearing civilian clothes. He wore a dark, form-fitting tactical suit, the kind that didn't officially exist. From a hidden pocket, he pulled a small, hardened device threaded with fiber-optic cables. His disguise was gone. His mask was off. Nomad 1 was back on the clock, and this was his hangar now. Figures emerged from the shadows. Soldiers who had been working alongside their comrades moments before now raised weapons, their faces cold and determined. They were the traitors, hiding in plain sight. They ignored the loyalists cowering for cover, and advanced on Apache 714, their objective clear: destroy the helicopter and the evidence of the conspiracy along with it. "They're trying to wipe the bird," Henry barked as he jacked his device into a maintenance port at the base of the terminal. Griggs had pointed out. "Protect that Apache. Form a perimeter." His voice, filled with a commander's authority, cut through the panic. The loyal soldiers, given a direction and a purpose, began to rally, laying down suppressing fire. Henry's fingers flew across the terminal's keyboard, lines of archaic code scrolling across the screen. He glanced up at the M230 chain gun he had so meticulously cleaned, a grim understanding dawning on his face. He toggled his internal comms, patching directly to the cockpit where Colonel Thorne was taking cover. "Colonel," the traitors hardwired the attack code, bypassing the cockpit controls, but they didn't bypass the manual maintenance linkage. "Get in the gunner's seat and power the main gun bus. Now." Thorne, without hesitation, scrambled into the seat and flipped the required switches. Down on the floor, Henry had turned his intimate knowledge of the machine's guts into a weapon. The lead traitor, a man built like a titan and moving with the deadly grace of a special operator, broke through the defensive line and charged Henry, a combat knife held in a reverse grip. He was a third of Henry's age and twice his size, expecting to cut down an old man hunched over a computer. He was wrong. Without taking his eyes off the screen, Henry shifted his weight. As the attacker lunged, Henry pivoted. He used the man's own momentum to spin him off balance, and in a single fluid sequence, delivered 3 precise, brutal strikes. There was a sickening series of cracks. The large man collapsed in a heap, his body broken and useless, his weapon clattering to the floor. It was over in less than 2 seconds. Henry never even stopped typing, a master demonstrating his art with contemptuous ease. The lines of code on Henry's screen resolved into a single command line. He hit enter. High above, the 30mm cannon of Apache 714 swiveled with silent, hydraulic deadliness. It wasn't aimed at the attackers. It was aimed at the massive electronic lock mechanism on the main hangar door. With a deep, percussive thump, the cannon fired a single non-explosive training round. The slug, a dense piece of metal traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, struck the lockbox with surgical precision. There was a brilliant flash of blue sparks and a shower of shredded electronics. The lockdown was broken. Henry ripped his device from the port and turned to the stunned colonel who was just emerging from the Apache. "I've isolated and purged the attack subroutine," Henry stated, his voice calm amidst the lingering gunfire. "But I also traced the last upload signal. It didn't come from inside this hangar. It came from the base command tower. The mastermind is still up there watching, and he has a direct line to the Secretary's security detail. The immediate threat was handled, but the final objective was now chillingly clear. As sirens wailed in the distance, the damaged hangar doors began to grind open, flooding the red-lit space with the harsh white light of approaching security vehicles. Loyal soldiers moved quickly, securing the wounded and rounding up the shell-shocked traitors. The battle for Hangar 3 was over. Henry Johnson stood before Colonel Thorne, his tactical suit now visible through his torn janitor's jumpsuit, a smudge of grease on his cheek. He looked every bit the Ghost, a man out of time. The colonel, his uniform disheveled and his face etched with a newfound humility, looked at the living legend who had just saved them all. "Your command, sir," Thorne said, the word no longer feeling strange. Henry's gaze wasn't on the carnage inside the hangar. It was fixed on the distant command tower, a modern spire of glass and steel that loomed over the base. The man at the top of that tower had tried to turn one of the Army's greatest weapons into an instrument of assassination, and he had failed only because of the old man no one had ever bothered to see. Henry's quiet retirement was over. The conspiracy was still alive, and its head was just a few hundred yards away. The watchman was back on duty. If you want to see how a living legend dismantles a conspiracy from the inside out, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories. We honor the quiet professionals who are always on watch. Join us and never miss a story.